Bonjour tout le monde. Je fais cette vidéo aujourd'hui pour discuter d'un certain sujet qui est en relation aux vidéos que j'ai précédemment partagées sur YouTube. Et aujourd'hui, je fais une vidéo sur l'importance de l'image. Parce qu'on parlait de l'imagination auparavant dans les vidéos. Et désolé pour tous ceux qui sont juste en anglais. Ils m'écouteront pas de toute façon en ce moment. And you know what I could do? Most French people understand English, so all I should do is speak English all the time. So today, we'll talk about the image and what it means in terms of representation. And as such, representation can be understood just as a, in its most basic sense, but also in its judicial sense or legislative sense, in terms of representations of identities and groups of people, and which are interrelated under the same representational basis. In legal terms, we're talking about denomination being the way you are represented under a unified banner of identity, so that legislatively you can operate under this identitary banner and then define it in actionable ways. For example, the educational system in Ontario is allowing Roman Catholics and Protestants to be denominated or found to have a denominational basis under law, which means that they have a capacity to define the traditions and cultures which are associated with their identity. So Roman Catholics are publicly funded by the government to run schools, and these schools are defined under Roman Catholic traditions and cultures and beliefs. All of that, and then precisely through that denominational basis, is how they have access to that public funding. And so, relating it back to representation, we can see how the legal system's capacity to represent certain beliefs or systems of beliefs as worthy of being characterized as denominational versus other types of beliefs, religious or otherwise, but fundamentally religious, at least in as much as religion is correlated and obviously interrelated with culture and traditions. And so if we would have to split the public sector obviously the public sector exists unbeknownst to religious beliefs as well, or separate from religious belief, but nonetheless, under denominational basis, Protestant and Roman Catholics are the two which have the capacity to receive public funding and still have say on the traditions and practices which are being taught to their students. And so keep that in mind if, as Ontarians and as Canadians, it would be interesting to see whether or not these denominational bases are the same in other Canadian provinces, or if there's a definite separation between public funding and religious entities of any sort. However, separation of church and state has been seen in the U.S. in their own charts of freedom and rights, and as well as more prominently through the Bill 21 in Quebec. Not necessarily in the same way education would have been affected, but obviously education is affected by Bill 21, which is the banning of any wearing of religious symbols. And as well, France has been a long time representative of the separation between church and state in educational systems, but in other state functions, such as governmental functions. And as such, we are left again with this sense in which in Ontario, this denominational basis, which gives so much more agency to Roman Catholics and to Protestant, is one which should be questioned on the basis of saying if these religious practices have the right to be denominated and as such have access to public funding, which other religious practices and beliefs should be accounted for in denominational ways. I think that's a good conversation, but I am detracting from the original topic, which is representation. However, I think a lot of you listening will see the relationship that I perceive in between denomination and representation in terms of legal actionability. However, representation goes beyond the legal means into media, advertisement, and entertainment in regards to making sure that the main systems of entertainment and of access to information that we use in our daily life is representative of the experiences of different identities as they arise in modernity, but as they also happened in history. And I have a very concrete example of this. In yesterday night, I sat down to watch a TV show, which was called The Porter, which was a TV show depicting a group of black, I think it was in Halifax, so black Canadians in the early 1900s or maybe late 1800s, who were working for a railway company, and the hardships that the black or African employees were facing in regards to their bosses, but also just the clients which were using the railway. And the whole TV show, I only watched the first episode, but I'm assuming we'll expand upon these topics in terms of understanding how the black community rallied under certain values in order to fight the oppression which surrounded them and which precisely oppressed them to the extent to which they were treated as unequal on their basis of payment, for example. And there's quite a poignant scene where an employee receives a misdemeanor once again for having been, and all of that by being accused of something that reportedly they didn't even know if he actually did, but nonetheless got the misdemeanor and got almost fired out of his position on the basis of the white manager having the capacity to do so without real repercussion. And the scene is quite intense and shows the amount of inequitable treatment that black people were facing back in that time of history, but presumably still to this day in potentially different ways. But I think remuneration is still one of the ways in which not only the black community, but other minority communities are still being oppressed or treated inequitably on the basis of remuneration. And this basis is still, I think, relevant in 2023, and will remain so as long as we perceive ourselves to live in a society of production, in a society of capital production, such as the capitalist realism, which I would recommend you guys read if you have the time. It's a very short book. Unfortunately, the writer passed away quite a few years ago, but the writer's name is Mark Fisher. And this book, let's talk about Mark Fisher just a little bit. He was a blogger, but most fundamentally, I would characterize him as a musical or like a cultural theorist, which used music, movies, books, the entire range of human production, creative production, and beyond, um, utilitarian production as well, like factories and industries. He would discuss in ways which would portray a reality which was fully encased and living in the capitalist ideal, and not necessarily in its idealized way, but as capitalism was portrayed to be in its potentiality. Mark Fisher proposed that we were now in a point in modernity where capitalism was the real as we were partaking in it, and he found extremely interesting ways of making his argument more poignant by referring to cultural products of our day through movies. He starts the book by referencing Children of Men, which was a movie by Alfonso Cuaron, and and essentially the movie discusses what happens once humans cannot reproduce, and it portrays kind of this post breakdown world where the big cities are populated by vagrants, and there's armed turmoil basically constantly happening in the streets, and essentially he's saying that, well, the main argument at the beginning of the book is to say that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And what he's proposing is that Children of Men is a good example of precisely a scenario where the world goes to shit, but capitalism remains the same in its function, regardless of whether the civilized world as we perceive it around us is in fact working or functional, or even considers the human rights of their participants, because the machine of capital will function nonetheless beyond it. And it's kind of like he's portraying a picture where precisely the end of the world is easier to imagine than the end of capitalism, because beyond capitalism is an even greater lack. And to that I refer to Nietzsche when he said that God is dead. And then he proposed that this proclamation would then it would announce the advent of a definite loss in meaning in a large part of the human population, on the basis of saying that rationality had killed God, and then all we would be left in its place would be a void of meaning, which had to be filled. But as if anyone's familiar with Nietzsche's reading or writing, precisely, I think you will see that this emptiness was quite expansive, and Nietzsche never seemed to fully escape the totality of the lack which was created by the death of God, at least in his own mode and operations of thinking. Operations of thinking. And so, in the same way, I pronounce capital to be the next god to be killed, in as much as it is important for us to see how capital is one of the things which is heralded as a deistic entity in our world. And if we presume it dead or non-functional anymore, to the very least, then we can start truly exploring the lack which is left after capital has been taken or removed from its position of intrinsic power in our ideology, but also truly in society, and in the ways our economy functions, our industries, and other, our banks. Many institutions function on capital to be the mechanism through which they achieve certain goals. And what Mark Fisher is presenting in his book is precisely a representation, an image of reality, which is it's at its end a capitalist one. But what he says is that obviously capitalism, as it has been conceptualized by thinkers back in the 1700s, was always seen in dialogue, to the very least, with a system of production and societal organization called communism. And what Mark Fisher proposes at the end is that if we are stuck in a real, which is capitalist, what do we do with the Marxist state, which is supposed to come and propose a worthy alternative to capitalism? And he calls it the super nanny state, which is where Marxism, to some extent, if we agree that we lived in a reality which is capitalist, then reality does not account for any virtue necessarily. And what he was proposing is to say that Marxism would be kind of seen as this a remedy, but precisely a remedy which was not real, but could act as this idealized remedy, which is not put in action, but which relaxes the mind in front of the dire consequences, which can be seen on the basis of capitalism running amok or doing its thing. As many capitalists would say, it's just capitalism does its own thing, and all you have to do is follow it. Follow it where it leads, and precisely where profit may be found. And some people would say that profit is not the only function of capitalism. Obviously, it's not. But at the end of the day, capitalism is a process which tries to commodify human resources, or you could call it planetary resources, environmental resources, and try to capitalize on it by commodifying it in a certain way. And so you could imagine any resource which is agglomerated and then goes towards producing a product which is then usable in a context where you have to use that product repeatedly, such as a vacuum, even a broom. The broom, but let's say the vacuum, and it's an electric vacuum. So you can imagine all the material parts and components which have to be agglomerated before the vacuum is produced. Same goes with a computer, a telephone, any electronic machine. There is a large part of the production goes into using certain resources in order to commodify them into a whole which is useful, or at least, to the very least, can be used. Because the problem with capitalism, or one of the problems with capitalism, is that it's not because you can produce a product that it is inherently useful to society. And this utilitarian, or this usefulness to production, is often leads us to be misguided about what needs to be produced and the amount of things that should be produced. And then we are left in this kind of culture of trash, of just throwing away things which we think are not necessary on the basis of overproduction and therefore overconsumption. But let's go back to the utility. If we produce a machine, then it has to have a certain function, or to the very least, it'll be commodified under the basis of that function being deserved. And so when you create that vacuum, the person or the company, the corporation, which will bring their agents and workers together in order to produce the vacuum, and then precisely by harvesting all the natural resources, and if not by themselves, will hire or connect with other corporations which harvest these resources. And precisely, you're left with the production of a vacuum as a commodity, which will then be sold at a certain price on the basis of its utility or function to the person buying it. And if you see that, I see that to be a very simplified way of seeing capitalism. However, it is in this way that we see the commodification process of the object, of the resource, of the natural resource, right? The untouched resource which has been transformed and manipulated in order to create the machine or the commodity, which will then go to serve our modern society. But on what basis are we defining our necessities of these commodities and the functions that they supposedly bring to us as a form of warped benevolence? And so I'll end the video there today, but consider this as you participate in the capitalist system and as you continue to buy, consume, and produce things which will potentially help society and humanity, or potentially lead them to their own financial downfall, or if you are truly the capitalist in its rational, egotistical form, as portrayed by Ayn Rand most famously, but obviously many other thinkers, although we cannot undermine the impact that Ayn Rand had on American politics and American financial thinking. All this to say, if we are to consider it truly, then what is the limits of capital accretion once the logic of capital has been stripped from any sense of responsibility towards the other and the fellow citizen, in which goes beyond the maintenance of capital.